This is section 3.3 and 3.4 notes. Section 3.3, communities. A community is populations of different species that occupy the same area. And there's two types of interactions within a community. They're either intraspecific, interactions within a species, or they're interspecific, so interactions between species, so species to species. Intra is within a species, and inter is species to species. There's many different ways that communities interact. There's predation, there's parasitism, there's mutualism, commensalism, and then finally competitivity. Predation is interaction where a predator organism feeds on another living organism known as prey. And here's a couple examples, the shark eating the seal and the lion eating the wildebeest. And when you have situations of predator-prey in a community, there a lot of times are keystone species. Keystone species are dominant species that have drastic effects on the equilibrium of many other populations in the ecosystem. This is a really good visual of how to think of a keystone species. This is the arch, ecosystem in the shape of an arch. And this center stone looks like a salmon, this fish on the center stone. If you were to take out that center stone, the rest of the arch would collapse. So if you remove the salmon from the ecosystem, the rest of these organisms would probably be either eliminated from the ecosystem or they'd be drastically affected. Symbiosis is a close long-term interaction between different species in which one species benefits. You'll find this a lot in different communities, and there's three different types of symbiotic relationships. There's parasitism, there's commensalism, and then there's mutualism. Parasitism, which is probably the most familiar, is one organism feeding on another organism, hurting its host. So there's a positive-negative relationship. These parasites have specific adaptations that allow them to live off another species. Some really common parasites are the tick. They live off, you probably either had a tick or know somebody that had a tick or your pet has had a tick. They live off their host organism. They just need to bite on and they get really big and they feed off the blood of their host organism. And then there's worms. I've got a couple good pictures of worms here. Flatworms, tapeworms, hookworms, all different kinds of worms that will live within your digestive tract and consume the nutrients that you are consuming, and they don't allow you to consume it. I have a video on my website that actually goes into talking about how parasites can actually control the brains of their host organism, and it's really cool and you should check it out if we don't watch it in class. Commensalism is another type of interaction that happens. It's a relationship where one species benefits and the other isn't harmed or helped. So it's a plus and a zero here. So one benefits and nothing really happens to the other one. And two examples are, I have an elephant here with a bird hanging out on its back. The bird gets a free meal because the elephant, as it walks the long grass, it scares up the bugs and rustles up bugs and insects that are hanging out in the long grass, and the bird can swoop down and get a free meal. It's a pretty cool relationship because the elephant isn't hurt or harmed, but the bird is getting a meal. And then there's the barnacle and whale. These bumps on the end of the fin are called barnacles, and they live on the skin of a whale. And as the whale goes about its business swimming in the sea, the barnacle catches a ride and it'll get its nutrients from the sea. It doesn't hurt or harm the whale, but it's totally beneficial to the barnacle because they wouldn't be able to survive without the whale. And then there's mutualism. Mutualism is a relationship where both species benefit. So it's a plus-plus relationship. We got two plus signs here. So the organisms that are involved in the relationship are mutually benefiting, hence the name mutualism. So a couple examples would be a hummingbird and a flower. This hummingbird gets the nectar from the flower, and as it goes from flower to flower eating, it will be pollinating the flower. So the flower is benefiting because it's being pollinated by the bird, and the bird is getting its meal. Another really neat example of mutualism is the clownfish and the sea anemone, which was made famous by the movie Finding Nemo. I'm sure many of you have seen it, if not all of you. And what happens with this relationship is that the clownfish seeks protection from the sea anemone. The sea anemone's little tentacles are venomous and they will kill its prey and it consumes its prey with its tentacles. However, the clownfish has a protective layer on it, so it's immune to this venom and this toxic tentacles that the sea anemone has. So it can live within it and be totally protected. So the clownfish benefits because it's protected. But then, because the clownfish is so brightly colored, it attracts prey for the sea anemone. And so the sea anemone can have its food. So it's a mutually beneficial relationship because the clownfish attracts food for the sea anemone to eat, while the sea anemone is protecting the clownfish from the predators that prey on it. Within competition or within communities, there's always competition, an interaction between organisms of the same or different species in which the fitness of one is lowered by the presence of another. I like to think of it, or when I think of competition, I think of sports. So take basketball, for instance. Um, one team will beat another team just because of how fit they are. They either shoot the ball better, they can run faster, they have more stamina, and so on and so forth. And the same goes for nature. But for fitness in nature, it's a little bit different. It's not about how fast you can run and how strong you are. Well, it is, but not as much as the ability for the species to survive and, more importantly, to reproduce. Because that's when you know you have good fitness, is that you can not only survive in the environment that you have been adapted to, but also reproduce, and then that your offspring can reproduce. That is when an organism has really good fitness. And when thinking about competition, there is something called the competitive exclusion principle, where species that are less suited to compete for resources will either adapt, be excluded from the area, or eventually die out. There's always competition going on in the communities, like I said before. So here's a good way to visualize it. This is competitive ability differences. You either are going to excel and be the superior competitor, or you're going to fail and be the inferior competitor. So you're either going to be superior and really excel in the community that you're in the environment and the ecosystem that you're in, or you're going to be the inferior. So you need to be able to find what kind of food source you can have and how the best way you can reproduce. You have to find the ability to adapt to the ecosystem that you're in. And if you don't, you're going to die out. So that brings us to section 3.4, ecosystems. Ecosystem is a natural unit consisting of all biotic factors functioning along with all of the abiotic factors. So ecosystem not only takes into account the biotic factors, but also the abiotic factors. And a habitat is the environmental area where a particular species lives. You'll find habitats within ecosystems. So the ecosystem is the whole here. This is a good picture to kind of visualize it. Here's the ecosystem. And then within ecosystems, there are habitats. And within habitats, there are communities. They're all interacting with each other. They're all connected. So just to review biotic and abiotic factors. Biotic factors, like we said before when we were looking at the Lion King video, are all of the living components in an ecosystem. So abiotic factors would be things like the air, water, light, wind, temperature, humidity, etc. And then biotic things would be like the organisms that are living in it and the plants and the animals. And also things like the competition that's happening, the predation that's going on, the symbiotic relationships, the mutualism, the parasitism, the commensalism, all of those things, disease. These all are having effect on the living, the biotic factors of the ecosystem. Also within communities, you find things called niches. Niches is a role a species plays in the ecosystem and the way it uses the full range of the abiotic and the biotic factors of that area, that niche. So things to consider, like what does it eat? What job does it perform? When does it mate? When does it eat? These are all important things that you need to take into account when you're considering an animal's niche. A species utilizes certain resources in its habitat, and depending on how many other species it needs to compete with determines its niche. So if you think of a lake, and there's all kinds of different species of fish in a lake. You have the bottom feeders that hang out along the bottom of the lake that will eat the organisms that are down there. And then you have fish that hang out in the middle of the lake that eat the organisms that also hang out in the middle of the lake. And then you have ones that are at the top of the lake and will even eat the organisms at the top of the lake. They each are occupying their own little niche of the lake. That's what that means. I also have uploaded a video to my website that it goes into depth about 3 different organisms that live in a watering hole and how they have occupied their niche. And there's 2 different kinds of niches. There's a realized niche and a fundamental niche. The realized is the role the species actually occupies, so the niche that it's actually occupying right now. And then a fundamental niche is when the role that the species could eventually, potentially occupy. So it's the niche that's available, but the organism hasn't taken advantage of yet. It's only in its realized niche. And then eventually it could move out to the fundamental niche where there's potentially more food, more space, etc. for them to take advantage of. This concludes section 3.3 and 3.4 notes.